So good day, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Behavioral Sciences Mediation and Moderation workshop. I am your facilitator, Dr. Letetia Addison, and I'm very happy to be here today to share with you an interactive session which touches on some introductory concepts related to mediation and moderation. So welcome. I believe most of you may be postgraduate students and beyond. So I just want to welcome you to the session today. This is always my disclaimer at the beginning that statistics is everywhere. I'm very, very passionate about statistics. And I think it's a key background that you need to be able to build that story that you want to tell based on your research. So in this session, of course, we will look into some of the applications using SPSS, but we will first think about the foundation because mediation and moderation is quite a vast topic. So we have to just start. We have to, I like to say, walk before we run, start somewhere and actually look at those ideas to build upon because it can get a little more intense in terms of the types of relationships you can look at. For those of you who may not know me, I am, well, as I said, I'm Dr. Letetia Addison. You may call me Letetia. I would say I'm a woman of many hats. I am a project officer at the University Office of Planning at the St. Augustine campus. For those of you who don't know what we do at the Office of Planning, I usually tell students and staff that those surveys that you all ignore in your emails, those are generated from our office. And we actually have a very large role to play in the strategic plan at the university. We are also involved in institutional research, and I have been involved in statistical and mathematical modeling with respect to lead with data, a campaign to look into data-driven models for educational insights. In addition to that, I'm also an adjunct lecturer in various faculties with courses involved in statistics and research. Some of you may know me from the Psych 6013 course, the Advanced Statistics and Research Methods. And I have been for many, many years, my background is in mathematics and statistics. For many, many years, I've been involved in the teaching of statistical courses, quantitative courses, consulting on research projects, and many different research interests in that regard, building models for sustainability, etc. So I'm very passionate about giving persons in different fields, in particular STEM and STEAM fields, as it stands, a true sort of sense of appreciation for what statistics can tell you about your study. And of course, I have other interests as well, as you could see on the screen. I really do want to create a positive change in the world. I'm also a woman in data science ambassador for Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm very, as I said, passionate about everything statistics and data related. So before we jump in, as it's my style to always give an icebreaker activity. So what I will do at this point, I'm just going to stop sharing. Now, this is the link. You can actually type in this link, go to this link, but I will actually send you, sorry about that. I will send you the link in the chat as well. So feel free to type in the link and there's a voting code here. I want to hear about what your expectations are for this session today. So let me just stop sharing and I will also send you the link here. So for those of you who want to give us an indication, I always like to have an idea of what you are expecting and how we can help. So here it is in the chat and take a couple minutes just to, it's open-ended, to give your thoughts on what your expectations are. I'll be able to show you all live as well. So in the meantime, let me see how it's going. Everyone is able to access the link?
Yes.
Yes. Excellent. Great. So as I said, this is anonymous. I really want to just have a gauge as to what's the climate in this particular session. I'm seeing some responses so far, so we'll give persons a few more minutes to responses. So I think we have about 11 persons in the chat, so we can see how great. So in the meantime, let me show you. This is like one of my favorite tools for interaction. Some of your results so far. Let me know if you are seeing my screen. Is everyone seeing the screen?
Yes, I'm seeing it.
Excellent. Yes. Well, please continue to put in your thoughts. The current ones I'm seeing so far. Someone said they hope to learn more about statistics in the social sciences. Hope to learn more about moderation analysis for your research project. Refresh your knowledge of mediation and moderation, and improve your proficiency in interpreting the output. Use SPSS as it relates to mediation and moderation, learn about the features, help you understand how to use it for future analysis. Someone also said they hope to learn about moderation and mediation statistics, a revision of linear statistics for your research. Great, great. Refresh your knowledge on the mediation analysis, have a better understanding of the statistical techniques for the thesis. Great, so I'm seeing, so you all could continue to add, but those are the ones that I'm seeing so far. So thank you very much for your input. I'm glad to hear what it is that you are interested in finding out in today's session. So let's jump back into the slides. Right, and just letting you know, for those of you who just joined, persons who joined before, if you could just drop the Dropbox link again. I had sent an email out previously with some previous materials with that link. So if you did not get it, I can always send it to you after the session with some screencasts and some other sessions we hosted before. Right, so moving along. Right, so as I said, so today's session, now we have I would say a steady set of segments. I'm going to do a very quick overview of linear regression because I didn't want to say this yet, but I will probably say this in one sentence. The mystery has been solved that mediation and moderation is actually a form of regression. So that's actually the entire idea you're going to realize today with what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to just quickly go through that. For those of you who were in the previous workshop, I would have gone through some of these concepts in the quantitative workshop. So I'm going to just review some of them again to give you just a kind of a refresher. Then we will look at an intro to mediation moderation. As I said, it's a very gentle introduction because it can be built upon after that. I would also indicate to you, some of you may or may not know this textbook by Professor Andy Field. You could let me know in the chat. He's now a professor. Dr. Andy Field, Discovering Statistics. He's quite, I think some of my past students find him quite eccentric in some of his YouTube videos, but he's very, very interesting and interactive. So for those of you who probably have not been able to use that text before, I will tell you that's a really, really fundamental text you should have, especially if you're doing work in your thesis, etc., to be able to refer to. So as you could see, we will look at the intro to mediation and moderation. I also have some of his materials in the files in the Dropbox folder as well. We will look at an SPSS demonstration, some of the results and discussion. I'm hoping we have time for our very fun collaborative activity where you'll be in groups. And if not, we will just do it all together. Then we will have our results and discussion, feedback and question and answer session. And we have a surprise guest speaker. So I wouldn't say who it is yet. Some of you may know this person. I especially invited them to talk to you about some of their research, which involves mediation and moderation, so you can actually see it come to life. So we're going to have a fun session today. As I said, you will have be able to recall the concepts, the introductory concepts, apply the software, and of course, analyze the statistical results critically, because I think that's the most important part, right? Thank you, Chelsea, for putting the link in the chat for everyone to follow. So moving right along, let us jump in. Now, linear regression. So stop me anywhere. You need to stop me if you need me to go over any concepts. What I really want to do is to get you to align your thinking with the fact that this is the core of what mediation and moderation is. So I'm going to start by just reminding you that in terms of the data you have data that can be qualitative or quantitative. And for your purposes, or for persons who would have used, now as this is a postgraduate course, so we are making the assumption that you all would have had some undergraduate background in types of data. I'm just bringing it back to your attention. Now, if it is you need a refresher, you forgot these things, it's fine. It's not a problem. It's not going to hamper you in any way. But I just want you all to recall that this is what you would have to think about when you actually do if you are giving out surveys, and if you are bringing this data into SPSS, you would really need to think about the type of data you're dealing with. And then in the qualitative and the quantitative data, you have things like so nominal data and ordinal data in the qualitative, which is the categories of data, right? So, of course, qualitative data, you have things like if you put your gender, you could actually make age, which is something more quantitative, into age groups, which can be categories or qualitative. And all of these things, you would be interacting with different types of data. So you're probably thinking, why is she stressing so much on this? Because I think sometimes what I've realized is a lot of the times when people collect data, they are very confused about the type of data they're dealing with. And when you go into the software, it's a little bit tricky now as to figure out, well, what analysis I'm going to use based on these types of the data and the variables that come about from this data. So we want to think about these things. We also want to think about, some of you are probably thinking, oh gosh, I don't remember all of these tests. That is okay as well. Just to bring back to your mind, for those of you who would have done an undergraduate course in statistics, you would have had different tests. We would call some of them parametric. They have a lot of these fancy assumptions about normality and all these things. I hope that's ringing a bell, right? And this would give you a context as to what you should probably have already known. For instance, if you want to test association between variables, you could think about, you would know correlations between what we call the independent and dependent variables. So today is going to be hearing about independent and dependent variables from beginning to end, right? And then you also have the non-parametric tests, which are basically a parallel version, where you don't have assumptions of normality holding. The data may somehow be maybe a small sample size, and you may not be able to meet those assumptions. So you have a parallel version to a non-parametric test. So for all of the different tests that you are looking for, you want to be able to understand which of these you have to use. So even like this difference between two groups, you would probably know about the independent samples t-test, and you'd have different types of variables to use there. You would know the way the dependent variable should be interval or ratio, and all of these things. So as I said, I'm just touching on these to kind of bring it back to mind. Difference among more than two groups, you would go to ANOVA. I always say ANOVA is just an inflated t-test. ANOVA, or analysis of variance, is just multiple t-tests, basically, right? And in that way, you could see now the progression of how we go along, where we have associations, taking specific types of variables, and then we're thinking about the correlations in terms of the word association. So when you're going from your research question to hypothesis test now, the wording is important. The difference between the groups, you could think about it and you have groups and categories, and you have some sort of scale or quantitative variables. You have male and female. You got some categories of, let's just say, they filled out a survey, some self-efficacy in statistics, and you have scores. We want to look at the differences between the groups. Maybe if gender is not just male and female, maybe they extend it to all the categories. You may have more than two groups. So you could also look at the one-way analysis of variance. in terms of the variables. So the independence, why I'm talking, as I said, all of this, the idea that I'm getting at is you're going to have variables of interest, and you'll have independent variables, you'll have a dependent variable, most of the time one dependent variable, and then you have an independent variable or variables. And that's where we come to prediction methods. And for those of you who probably heard about data science and these types of things, prediction is quite important because you want to be able to say, based on what I have collected, and when I do calculations, can I use this? Can I create an equation that will tell me, if I take some new data and input it into the equation, what would be the value for self-efficacy in terms of statistics, for a male then. So you have to think about what are the insights I'm trying to get, right? So the idea now from linear regression, and linear regression is the one where we have an independent variable. So we have simple linear, we have multiple, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is to get at this idea of having a dependent variable, and then you have some other variable or variables which actually impact on that. So we're just going to keep it simple with linear. There's also logistic regression, which is also a different element in terms of risk. So also just letting you all know, you could always stop me at any time. Feel free to ask me any questions. So correlation and regression, they go hand in hand. So I'm going to just recap this. Some of you would have seen it in the previous session, but this is quite important for this session. So correlation itself, remember, this would measure the strength and direction. You see those two words there, you're going to hear me say that later again somewhere in mediation and moderation. So just keep that in mind, of the linear relationships between two continuous quantitative or scale variables. So a lot of the times you would calculate the sample correlation coefficient. The research question you would be thinking about is there statistical evidence that a linear relationship exists among these pairs of variables? And you have certain assumptions. So today we're going to just assume we are meeting the assumptions. So we're not going to go too much into them, but we assume they are normally distributed. Now, I'm bringing back my interpretations of R, because as I said, everything is a bridge to what you're going to think about later on today, where you're going to have to think about how these correlations impact those relationships. And how do we measure that? We measure that with the value of R. So that's the correlation coefficient. And we have scales. Now, students always are really wanting to figure out, well, when I see this value, like if it's 0.2 or 0.3, what does that mean? I always want you to kind of think about it in terms of measurable words that you're going to give. So if you are given values, these ranges can give you a sense of how to describe the values. Because remember, you want to be able to not only quote the quantity, but you want to describe it. So when you go to your discussion, it makes sense to someone off the street who is reading your work, right? So you could go from a scale of 0 to 100, 0 to 100%, or you could keep it in decimal form. And you could see in this way, I can actually quantify that correlation to be a very weak correlation, and it could be positive or negative, right? In this case, I'm just giving you the quantity without the signs for now. And then it could also go to very strong. So for instance, you could actually have the same values there, go from positive to negative. And if it's 1, well, that would be a perfect positive correlation or 100% correlation between the variables, right? Usually that's actually between the same variables as some of you would know from your, when you do your SPSS output. And then you have weaker positive correlations. They may be negative in sign. Now, when you come to the linear regression and you come to these explanations of these variables, it's very important for you to think about what the signs are telling you in terms of the regression equation. So keeping those things in mind, you know what the relationship is in the core. Now, I always tell students, once you start with a data set, don't just jump to go into a regression. You need to understand the exploration of the data, what the variables look like, do some plots, do some bivariate correlations, especially for these quantitative variables in particular, because you want to see if they are correlated very well or not. And sometimes if they're too correlated, that could also be a problem of multicollinearity. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Now, this is another very important metric. So we spoke of the correlation R. So keep that in mind. So you're keeping R in your mind. You could square R and you have the coefficient of determination. Now I put this table also for a reason, because as I said, sometimes as I know students get trouble with the interpretation in words. So I'm giving you a worded interpretation to think about. Now, what is R squared? So R was the relationship or the association between the dependent and the independent variable there. What R squared does is it tells you the percentage variation in Y. Let's call Y our dependent variable. You can think about it in an XY axis. And it's the percentage variation in Y explained by X. So if you don't even know what that means, just remember when you were in, I know it's CSEC now, I did CXC, you were drawing graphs with the Y and the X axis, and you were drawing a line, Y equal mx plus c. I hope you all remember that one. And that's basically a linear regression equation, right? So you have your Y, which is your dependent, you have your X, which is your independent. Now, I'm stressing on the coefficient of determination because it tells you a lot of information. That square value there actually gives you an idea of how strong the relationship is between the independent and dependent. So when we go to the regression part, you're going to see how I'm going to describe that. So for instance, if you get a coefficient of determination of, let's say, 0.7, that means it's a strong positive relationship between the variables, right? And in terms of the independent and dependent variables, 70% of the variation in the dependent variable is explained by the independent variable. Anybody wants to tell me what do you think would have happened with the 30%? Any ideas? Like if 70% of the variation is explained by the interaction between the relationship between these two variables, what about the 30%? Any ideas about that, like off the top of your head? You could say it in the chat, or you could put on your mic. I want you all to start to interact a bit more. I think someone is saying in the chat, other factors, right? Third variable, right? Yes. So I want you all to start to think about the ideas. Exactly. Something else is right. Oh, Aaron is talking about moderated relationships, so we get in warmer. And it's not only that, all kinds of things can happen. Like for instance, I did physics way back in school, and I can tell you, we used to do this pendulum experiment. And a lot of the times, everybody was getting different values. Sometimes because if I did the experiment, I was standing up close to the air condition, it may be blowing my pendulum may be oscillating faster than somebody else who wasn't near. So my equation then, I'm just trying to say, in the end, it may be different. The interaction between, or the relationship, sorry, between those variables may ended up, so I might get 70% coefficient of determination, somebody else might get 60%. So there's something else happening outside that's influencing that relationship. So think about those things. So just some food for thought as we go along. So I'm hoping that was a nice crash course on correlation, just to kind of get you all to kind of remember some of those concepts. This moves really seamlessly into linear regression. Now, linear regression, as I said before, Y equal to mx plus c, as you all know, right? Now, of course, you all are postgraduates, so you all got a little more advanced with it in terms of building these, what I call prediction equation or predictive equations, where you could predict one value from the other. Why would we draw these graphs in school? Because when we got the x value, another x value, we could substitute it and get the y, right? So the idea here is that, and remember the word is linear. So it's the relation between two or more variables. So the research question generally would be, is there statistical evidence that a predictor variable linearly predicts the outcome or the dependent variable? And I put in brackets based on the regression coefficients. So here's what I want you all to also think about. The regression coefficients are very important to tell you the way that relationship is actually changing. So keep that in your mind. The regression coefficients, so it's B or beta, what have you in SPSS. Sometimes you call it B. Later on, you're going to hear me call it B when we do moderation and mediation. So keep that in mind. Those regression coefficients are very important. So simple linear has one independent, one dependent. Multiple has two or more independent variables and one dependent variable. And of course, you know, in the dependent variable here, we're thinking about a scale variable, or else if it's logistic regression, you could have them in categories, binary and multinomial, etc. So just to give you an example, I'm going to bring up some output there, and I just want you all to give me some answers about the output, so you could actually make sure you recap some of these ideas. We have this, and this is also a data set that was done previously, and we can also share with the persons who are joining. But as I said, no knowledge loss, because this is really the idea of what happened in this data set here in a snapshot. So you could see you have age, exposure to COVID-19, inter-household contact, right? And the inter-household contact had values of face-to-face and virtual. So those were predictors. So we wanted to see if those were predictors of mental and emotional well-being, which is our dependent variable. You have your null hypothesis about the exposure, that they don't predict it. And then you have the proposed or the alternative, that they will significantly predict mental and emotional well-being. So we're just going straight from simple into multiple linear. So I'm just going to throw the output at you. So looking at this output, I want people to give me some ideas as to what they are seeing in the output, to kind of see what you'll see when you see SPSS output, and if it's anything meaningful to you. I'll draw your attention to, so this is just a snapshot of if you have to do this in SPSS, right? And then the model summary, and then we have the ANOVA, because when you do regression, you're going to get the correlation, you're going to get the analysis of variance with some significance values, and then we're going to talk about the regression equation. So just as a preliminary aspect, anybody wants to tell me what they see in here, anything that's looking meaningful from the model summary, the ANOVA, anything? If you're not seeing anything, that's fine, or if you're not sure how to interpret, that's fine. But anybody wants to jump in and start us off? What about the R value and the R squared? So those are the two we were talking about previously. That 0.58, can you tell me or give me an idea of how that, what do you think about that value? And I want to hear it in a measurable way. So I see someone is saying here, right, so Aaron is saying moderate relationship. Well, before we get to that, regression is significant. Okay, so let's dial back a little bit. What does this 0.58 tell me? This R value. Anyone? So let's think about positive linear correlation, negative linear correlation. The R value suggests, Dion says that a moderate relationship with 34% of variance, right? So Dion went straight into, right, very good, Dion. That's really like what I wanted you to capture. So basically, you're getting the idea that you have 34% of the relationship. So you see how the R squared is actually explaining the R a bit more. The R is telling you there's a positive linear correlation of 0.58, right, in the model. And then the R squared is telling you 34% of the variation is explained. So in this particular case, the mental health and emotional well-being variable, and then our independent variables, 34% is explained by this model. So something else is happening that we didn't account for, right? Then the analysis of variance, if you want to look at the F value or the significance value, it's less than 0.05. So if you remember, in terms of hypotheses, P less than 0.05 means that we reject the null hypothesis. So therefore, remember the null, there was no relationship. The alternative is there's a significant relationship. So there appears to be some significant relationship. You see me summarize that after. What about this table? This table is very, very important. So please keep this table in mind, because everything you're going to be doing in the second hour is going to kind of capture some of these coefficients here. So what about this table? Anybody could just tell me, what is this table telling me? Give me some ideas. Throw out anything that you're seeing of interest. Anything at all, even anything very small. Oops, sorry about that. So let me start you off. Let's break it down to the first column by model, right? Constant, age, have you been in contact with someone face-to-face and virtual? So we have these different variables here. The dependent variables, mental and emotional well-being, right? So these unstandardized or B or beta coefficients, you see it B here, and then you see standard errors for them as well, and then you see standardized versions. So we'll talk about all of these. All of this is like my y equal to mxc equation. So basically it's telling me I could form an equation. So just by looking at this, I could actually tell you the equation or the predicted equation based on that data that I have is mental and emotional well-being is actually explained by, is equal to, if you want to think about it in a mathematical sense, 35.6 plus the variable age by 0.189 plus the primary contact variable multiplied by 0.78. So this is the coefficient of that variable. Each of these are the coefficients. And then you have the significance values, and you could ignore the one for the constant. You have the significance values for each. So you could see age is greater than 0.05, but you could see all the others are less than 0.05. So in this particular model, it appears, now this is multiple regression where we threw all the variables into the equation, right? So you could see that there's no significant. So let me just actually go to features here. And as I said, this is a central thing that you have to keep in mind. So for instance, I could at the top here tell you this is the equation you would have gotten from that. Mental and emotional well-being, these are the variables in blue that we were looking at initially. And we could see the coefficients of the variables. We could see the correlation coefficient, the squared value, the R squared value, and that unstandardized beta coefficient is really the increase. So what it's telling you, and it's, as I said, it's going to be very important for you to quote these values. It's telling you that the average increase in mental and emotional well-being associated with a 1 unit increase or decrease, depending on the sign. So let's put that in layman's terms. A 1 year increase in age, let's look at age. On average in this model, that means that your mental and emotional well-being will increase by 0.189 on average, right? What about the COVID-19 contact? The coefficient is minus 7.8 on average. Your mental, if a 1 year increase, or sorry, a 1 point increase in COVID-19 contact or 1 person increase will result in a decrease in your mental and emotional well-being by minus 7.8 and so on, right? And then of course we know that we had them statistically significant or not, and age seemed or appeared to be, I'm saying appeared because of where we put age in the model. So at this point, anybody has any questions? Is it okay so far? You're kind of getting the idea of where I'm going with this. I'm hoping that you're kind of getting the idea of how to make sure that you understand those core concepts. I'm just mentioning this now. This is not, don't get alarmed by this part. This is just to kind of tell you there's also an extension of hierarchical regression, which is one that we had done previously as well in the previous workshop, where instead of throwing all the predictor values into one part of the SPSS model, you could actually put them in what we call blocks. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because it really gives you an idea. Remember, we were talking about just now that R squared and how sometimes something happens outside that could affect, right? In hierarchical regression, when you add your variables in a, I like to say a hierarchy or those blocks, you actually kind of give an indication of which variables are you're controlling for in the first block, and then which other variables you're testing to see would affect the relationship. So in that way, it really gives you an idea of the theoretical grounds of what you're doing. So I always tell students, if you want to do a hierarchical regression, it's not a big difference from the linear regression, except you're going to put your variables in blocks, but you actually put in them according to some theory that supports, let's just say, age in terms of the COVID-19 example. Maybe you're controlling for age because age will not affect, you read somewhere, there's some theory that says age does not affect those relationships. You could control for age by putting the first block and then add into separate blocks. So the reason why I'm telling you about the block idea is because we're going from thinking about regression and just throwing all our variables into the model to some sort of arrangement now of how those variables could impact. So you're starting to think about the language I'm using. It could impact the model in a different sense. right? So for instance, just to recap the idea, as I said, we're not going into hierarchical, but I'm just giving you an idea of how that would have looked. If you wanted to know how well optimism predicts life satisfaction, you could actually, after you control for age, you could enter age in the first block and then optimism in the second block in the same regression window. So that way you could actually see the relative contribution. So why I'm saying it like that, you're going to actually see how these variables contribute now separately to the model. Right. So I hope that was hopefully a comprehensive and a concise recap, very speedy recap, but I'm hoping that I kind of gave you all the ideas of what we want to think about as we go, as we move seamlessly, I like to say, into mediation and moderation. So I would like you all to give me some thoughts on what you see is happening here. Now I have labeled some of these relationships here. I put an independent variable to add a dependent variable, and then there's some sort of relationship happening with a 2 next to it. There's a 3. Anybody wants to give me any ideas of what they're seeing? Look at the placement of the variables. So keep it in mind. This was the original relationship you would have seen, an independent variable or variables going straight to dependent, right? Which is what we saw in the example previously. Look at what's happening. So that was the original relationship 1. Some independent variable impacting that dependent. Look at what's happening with 2. This relationship is going through a mediator variable, right? I see someone saying something in the chat. The impact of the moderator and the mediator, right, between the independent, right? Thank you, Catherine, very good. So you're actually seeing now there's a difference forming here where we are looking at it in a different lens. So the mediator variable is something, the independent variable, something's happening through that to come back to the dependent. And then the moderator variable is impacting at 3, is impacting that relationship. So keep that in mind because you'll have a little remember those concepts. So this is what I wanted you all to observe. And I'll give you an example. So between that independent and dependent, this is what we were looking at all along. So we're just going back to a simplistic idea. If you have, say, sleep quality and academic achievement, you would see that it affects changes or impacts, which is what we already know from regression, right? You have the predictor or the cause of the change. You have the dependent variable, which is the response or the effect. So you have that arrow there, and it could affect it. What about this? This is what I wanted you all to get at now. So what if I add in this mediator? There's another variable called alertness. So remember I was telling you all just now, we could have something happening on the outside that we didn't account for. We're going to account for that now. So the mediator variable goes between the variables and explains how the independent and dependent variables are related. So you could see now what's happening here between sleep quality and academic achievement. It can affect it through, through the variable or the mediating variable alertness. So there is something that is actually explaining how those variables are related. Now, also before we move on, I also want you to think about this black arrow represented what we call a direct effect. So there was something directly happening here. And then you would have some other, let's call, remember I was telling you, if something is happening outside, some indirect impact or effect happening outside there. That is what we're trying to explain here. Then what about this one? This relationship now, you could see we have another variable, which is a moderator. You could see the placement there is that it's actually impacting or acting on the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. Now, I need you to understand the difference between those two first before you actually want to jump in, because what I think happens is sometimes when people collect the data, they aren't sure. And I will always tell you, make sure that you have some supporting theories, supporting literature, because sometimes when you just collect the data and you're not sure which one is mediator, which one is moderator, that's where the confusion lies. So take your time, go through the literature, see how your study aligns with it and the variables that you are calling mediators and moderators, and then be able to decipher. This one, mental health status, right? So for instance, the moderator acts on the relationship, and you could say that mental health may moderate the relationship the relationship, keep that in mind, between sleep quality and academic achievement. Now, somebody on the street is not going to understand what that means, right? So you're going to say, well, okay, it can be that the relationship might be stronger. The relationship, right, might be stronger for people without diagnosed mental health than for people with them. Now, this is just an unsupported claim right now, right? We have to test that to see. Anybody has any questions? I have a little, sorry, this is looking so blurry. I have a little cartoon to show you all that I created to kind of quantify the ideas. Does anybody have any questions at this point before we move on? So let me play this video for you. And then
Dr. Addison, you could just briefly go over the difference between the mediation and moderation one more time.
Sure, no problem. Yes, no problem at all. And I will also show you it in the little cartoons video as well, a very cool video. So let me just go back this again. As I said, no problem. You'll feel free to stop me, right? Catherine, I'll let you, I'll find out from the department if they will release the recording. I'll let you all know. So let's just look back at the mediator variable. So you'll notice what's happening there, right? You could see that there's something between the independent and dependent, but then there's also a relationship happening through some other variable, which we call the mediator variable. So it's a go-between. In my layman's terms, I will tell you it's a go-between variable explaining how those two variables are related. It's giving you a how. So when you see I'm giving away the answers. So when you see the cartoon video, you're gonna see these questions of something with how. So it's actually telling me how are these variables related? So in sleep quality and academic achievement, the how there is their alertness or their mental alertness, right? It's mediating that relationship or those variables then. In the moderator is acting on, so like some examples in this case would be the mental health status. That mental health status is not going directly from sleep quality to academic achievement, as you could see. It's acting on the relationship between the two. So whatever relationship is happening between those two variables, it's acting on that. So when you change a moderator variable, when you change the levels, if it's the mental health status changing in different categories, even if it wasn't mental health, let's say it was gender, you have male and female, right? Those things would actually impact now the relationship between the two or moderate the relationship. Are you all seeing the difference there? So it's like one versus the other. You can't have a mediation moderate. You could have a mediating moderator. You could have, I don't want to confuse you, but you could have some other different aspects in terms of relationships. These are the simplest ones to think about on the onset. So in your brains, just think about it like one is in the relationship between the two, which is a moderator, and the mediator is acting on the go-between, like what is happening between these two variables. There's something between them, right? So there's something happening between the variables themselves. Hoping that is clearer. Let me show you the little video. Just let me know if you're hearing the audio when I start to play. And you'll have a little, I'll give you a little quiz so that will help. Okay, so I hope that was a little exciting for you all. Anybody has any questions? Well, you can actually probably try this little quiz. So we will do this little quiz. It's about 4 or 5 questions. The Google form, let me see if I can place it in the chat for you. And or you can type in the link there. I know it's a long link, so let me see if I can places in the chat. And what y'all could do is fill out that little quiz, and then we will take, after that, we will just look at if you have any questions on the answers, and we'll take like a 5-minute break. So let me see, 1 second, let me see if I can get that in the chat for you. So in the meantime, I'm just going to, let me just stop sharing. So we'll place this in the chat, 1 second. Right, so just check in the chat there. So Priya has places in the chat for you. Let me know if you could access it. I'll just stop sharing for a second, so give you all a few minutes to just to look into that. So you could take a 5 minutes and think about it. It's really to kind of get your mind to thinking about what does mediation and moderation mean before we kind of get more into the aspect of looking at how to actually do each of these. So let me know if you all can access. Accessible? Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. So at this point, what I'll do is it's 11:57. So I think it's a good time for us to take a break before we jump into the other 2 sections with each of these. So I will give you all, I was going to give you all a 5-minute break from 12, but I'll give you all about a 7 or 8, probably 8 minutes. It's 11:57 on my clock right now. So we can have a break until 12:05 if that's okay with you all. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions, feel free to let me know, and we will look into the little quiz afterwards. I think you should be able to get the answers one time. Just let me know if they're showing up for you as you go along. And if you have any questions on it, you could feel free to ask me after the break. So we'll just take a short break at this point. Before we do any questions, can you share the link to the, oh, who's that? Oh, Catherine, oh, sorry, you want the PowerTunes link? Sure, that's fine. I'll share that as well. Do the questions, and yes, Sable, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, you can just put in your answers there as you go along and click submit, and you should be able to see your score at the end, right? Let me send you all the PowerTunes link again so you can view the video. I'll send it in the chat. So YouTube link, so you could feel free to go on YouTube and watch it. Let's see. 1 second. So let me know if you all could access. Oh, sorry, it's pasted. I don't know why it's pasted as a picture. 1 second. Sorry, Zoom is doing something. Right, great. So it's in the chat there for you all, right? So we will have a break until 12:05, and then we'll come back and jump back in again. Okay, so I hope you all got through. How was the quiz? You were able to see your answers show up? Yes? Excellent. So I hope all of you were able to attempt it. It's really to kind of give you a little bit of a feel. So, right, so in this second hour now, what we are going to do is we're going to jump right in to kind of talking about each of these. Now, as I said before, for those of you, has anyone joined that did not get the link for the Dropbox? Because I know some persons were joining as well a little later on when I was actually going through some of these slides. If anyone did not get the link for the Dropbox, please share it with them in the chat again. So let me go back and share, because what will happen, I'll have to switch to the folder with some of the materials. In the meantime, before we begin, let me probably just go through, let me share my screen, and I'm just going to show you what's in that Dropbox folder for those of you who would have joined us a bit later on, right? So this is the folder you should be, well, this is what you would have had access to, right? Right, thank you, Shanique, for sharing. So what I did in this folder, there's a sample mediation moderation write-up in APA that is kind of just going to kind of summarize things in a really nice form for you. Then we have some files, SPSS files with output. So we will actually retrieve some of those afterwards. If you would like in the meantime to download that folder and access, you can do so, because there will be a collaborative activity as well for you all to try if we get the time. But I actually have this gambling study output is the one I'm going to be doing. You're going to see me do snapshots, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult for me to keep switching. I want to talk to you all about the snapshots first before we actually look at how it's done in the program, right? So feel free to download it. Now, I would like to let you know as well, so the SPSS file is there. In the gambling study output folder, you're going to find that there is the SPSS output for both mediation and moderation, also the word output, if it is that you do have SPSS right now in your system, right? I'm assuming most of you would, but if you don't, just let me know. You can let me know in chat if you don't, right? But it's there for you. If we don't get to the exercise and mood, which is your collaborative activity, that's okay, because we have a very special guest speaker who will give you a lot of context into how to shape your discussion, your results and your discussion. So I'm very excited for you all to hear from our guest. So that is there for you. The other part of the folder would be some files on the macro. So before we actually jump in, did you all get to follow? I think not all of you would have gotten my email Wednesday. Probably if you registered later than that, I would have sent an email about downloading the process macro. For those of you who got the email, were you able to download it and integrate it into SPSS easily? Yes? Okay, anybody had any problems? Because you can let me know. I will just recap. When we get to that part, I will sort of give you all a context as to how to download it. And in the meantime, there is also, for persons who, I said, let me just explain all of this to you now. For persons who would like to not only just go from like this series into the actual write-up, I have a paper which I found was very, very useful in terms of, yes, Mrs. Mohammed Ramlaka. Yes, what you can do, those of you who did not receive that email, please let me know, send me an email afterwards. I will put my email for you in the chat and I will just forward that mail to you. It was just to really give you some background material. So I'm going to just put my email address here. If you didn't receive the initial email, feel free to email me, right? So I also added this paper, under what conditions can introverts achieve happiness? It's a full research paper using both mediation and moderation, and they are slightly different versions, serial mediation, serial moderation. But once you know the background, when you read the paper, you would actually see. So once we have some time, I will actually show you all how that came about, and the actual data set for that paper. You're very lucky. They have it online and it's open. So I'll just click on the paper so you could see this paper. You can find this is a Ph.D. article. Now, when you're looking for articles, please try to look for articles that are are peer-reviewed from reputable journals. And this one has mediation and moderation effects on the quality of social relationships and emotional regulation on happiness. Now, what I liked about this paper is that you get a full context of how to do both analyses in one shot, and you get some of the diagrams, which we'll talk about there, as well as I'm just scrolling through quickly to kind of give you all an idea of how it looks. And then the results, and of course, to build the discussion as well. So they have a lot of key features that are important for you to think about. The way it's structured as well. For those of you who are a little more advanced, you would find this very useful for your research. And of course, the actual data set is also, I put the actual data set for you to see. What I would encourage you to do, and this is what I used to do as a PhD student and also a master's student as well, I would, if I got papers that had the data sets available, I would do the analyses and see if it corresponded to what the papers had. So that actually see. Now, bear in mind, some of these people may have made mistakes in between. So remember, do that with a grain of salt, but at least you would get some exposure there. Right, so this is the basic folder for those of you who didn't get access previously. Right, so everything is in here for you. So let's jump back into our slides. What I was trying to do is I am trying to give you the context of it first, and then we could see if we can jump into the actual SPSS to do the steps, or if it is that you all could just work with the output, because I really think most of you would want to understand how to interpret the results. So jumping back in, what we spoke about earlier was, and actually I'm hoping that you all got from the little video, that mediation and moderation, you could see the difference now in terms of the question you could ask yourself. Mediator explains how or why independent variables related to the dependent variables. So remember earlier I was telling you that relationship that you can go from, well, from independent to dependent, and you see there's a mediator variable, the alertness. How did it work? So you're focusing on the mechanism, the causal chain of events, or the underlying process. How, right? The moderator shows when or under what. You see how those questions, so the mediator is how or why. The moderator is when or what or who did it work for in terms of the conditions of the relationship. So when you ask yourselves those questions, when you actually build in your study, it will make it easier for you to understand which one you're looking at. Oh, whether a variable is hypothesized, and this is very important, as a mediator or moderator is driven by the research question that you have and your theoretical interests as well. As I said, please keep very aligned with the literature, and of course, with those of you who have supervisors on your projects as well, to be able to understand which of these. So we're going to demystify, first of all, mediation. So at the end of this section, what you're going to find, now, I am going to speak about certain things that you may not necessarily do everything of in this session, but some key points that I need to make for you to understand how to build would be, besides identifying the mediation analysis and statistical research, understanding that you can perform the mediation without the process macro, but you have some components that you need to think about for that to happen. And I will give you some additional links that will make it easier for you to follow the steps post this session as well, right? So then we'll run the analysis, and then we'll also. So jumping right in, let's think about, this is Barron and Kenny, 1986. Basic mediation, this is how it looks. So remember we said explains the how or the why, where X is related to Y, right? So you have your predictor variable in Barron and Kenny's model. He had the, sorry about that. He had the predictor variable X, the outcome or criterion Y, and then you have this mediator here. Now remember earlier I used this word direct. You see, that's A, B, and C. these are things that would be key for you to think about when you are putting in. So those are the connections of those relationships between those variables there. X to Y, the predictor or the independent variable X to the dependent Y has a direct or total effect there. That total effect, right, is called C. So we're going straight from C to, from X to Y. Now, you have a direct effect when it comes to predicting X from predicting the X prediction of Y, right? Predicting Y from X when controlling for M. So you've taken into consideration this value. You could call that, let's call that C, let's call it C prime, right? Now you notice you have something happening between X and M, and you also have something happening between M and Y, the mediator and Y. So you have that product, the product of this A and B is actually your indirect effect, because you're going to actually quantify these things with values in a little while. So that indirect effect, or AB, is actually the difference between the total effect between these two, which would have occurred before you even think about having a mediator, and then that direct effect controlling for this relationship. It's a kind of a mathematical sort of thing, right? So this is how the relationship looks. This is a really nice diagram that usually you would probably want to find yourselves putting in. Now, some of you may have more than one mediator and that sort of thing, depending on the study you're doing, right? Now, I'm going to go a little more math, and I hope you all don't mind, because this is actually going to just show you something. Don't get alarmed. Just remember y equals to mx plus c in all cases, right? This is just an extension. The reason why I'm showing you this is I'm wanting to show you something interesting. Now, think about the multiple regression we spoke about earlier. Remember, we had a nice long equation, right? All I'm showing you here is the same thing we had just now. But what you're going to see here, you have your indirect effect. The indirect effect, we say, is the mediated effect of X on Y. So that is our A multiplied by B. So you just, as I said, just keep these things in mind. Don't worry if you're not following everything yet. It's just so you to kind of see in retrospect, you'll reverse engineer when you see the output and you'll say, oh, that's what she was talking about, right? So this is what you want to keep in mind. So you have this A and this B. Then you have the direct or the unmediated effect. This is before anybody even thought about some sort of variable mediating the relationship. That's the C prime there. So what's happening here? You could see at the top, we have M. The relationship between M and X is actually like a regression equation as well, right? Because there's something happening between those two, just like how there's something happening between X and Y. And in the end, you could see when you include this M, so this equation only includes X, the one for the mediator. But when you come down here, you would notice that the equation in the end here includes the constant. So beta 0 is like your C and your Y equal to mx plus C equation. And then you have the M, and then you have your X here. So basically what I'm showing you in the end is the regression equation would have included now this mediator variable. Originally, it would have been just Y equal to beta 0 plus beta 2x, Y equal to mx plus C, right? Like we were seeing earlier. And in this case, we included this value. So hopefully that wasn't too much math, but I wanted you all to kind of appreciate how it looks visually. Because what you will have to do is you're going to have to pull out of your output these values for A, B, and C and these things to kind of give context to the relationships. So I'm just going to kind of talk you through this very quickly. Don't worry if you don't catch everything, but the reason I'm going to tell you this is that a mediational hypothesis, if the steps are met, then the variable is set to completely mediate the X and Y relationship. So you want to show that X is correlated with the mediator. Basically, what Baron and Kenny did is to say that it's complete mediation or full mediation from that variable. You have to show that X is correlated with the mediator. So you're doing correlations, remember that. To demonstrate that Y is also correlated with the mediator, you have to do a correlation between those two. So think about that, but your output will tell you that. And then demonstrate that the full mediation of X on Y, where we say controlling for M, that's the parts A and B, should be 0. So you'll get all of that in your output. If that doesn't happen, if it is that your full mediation process here is not 0, what you would see, the output will really show you is that it's probably a partial mediation. So I'm just telling you that because some of you may find that you might end up with saying, oh, shucks, but it's not mediation. So you might say it's not mediation at all, right? But it's not true. It may be a partial mediation. I just wanted to bring that to your attention, right? So that indirect effect that we were talking about with the coefficients, what I was telling you before, you could actually do this in a series of regression, right? So even if you didn't have the process macro, but we focused on the process macros since it makes it easier. But I will send you all a link before the end of the session to show you how you could actually do it from scratch in SPSS just by using usual regression. You could run the regression with the independent variable and find that estimate, as we said, A, run it with the independent variable and the mediator. So remember I spoke about the correlations just now. This is all you're doing. You're doing a series of regressions and you're getting the coefficients. Remember those betas that I told you all about earlier? That's what you'll be doing. So you would actually, so this is basically giving you a context of how to test that mediation has occurred. Mediation meaning that indirect effect, that path of AB that we were speaking of. So the summary of the idea is there for you to just take away from what I was just saying, all the mathematics, all the numbers and everything, is that the independent variable hypothesizes that mediator, so it in turn influences the dependent, which I was telling you all before, right? That's a bridge between the two. So therefore, what you are going to ask in your hypothesis now, whatever you are coming up with based on your research question, is there an indirect effect of X on Y through M? Or how does X affect Y? That is mediation. If that's the question you're asking, if that is what your variable is asking, that is mediation. So I'm trying to making sure that you all understand what it looks like before you jump in and just do the analysis blindly, right? So the mediator, as I said, could be any hypothesized social, psychological variable which may influence through which X may influence Y. And there are a lot more. There are a lot more complex models than these. I think the process macro, when we discuss it, has about 70 plus different types of mediation and moderation models you could try, right? So I want you to see an example of how the figures would look before we go into looking at it in the output. This is Pollack and et al. In 2012. This is an example of mediation. The hypothesis was that the relationship between entrepreneurs, economic stress, and withdrawal intentions is mediated by depressed affect, right? You could see it in the diagram here. So economic stress was the independent variable, withdrawal intention was the dependent variable, and you have the depressed affect is the mediator M. I hope you're looking at that R² value, which I was talking about earlier, right? Age and gender were controlled for in this, right? So age and gender weren't going to change the relationship significantly in terms of what they were doing here. We wanted to see how these three were impacting on each other. So you would see how the figures now turned into these. So when you go into the macro, the process macro, as we will talk about in a little bit, you'll see how you'll be able to retrieve like this 0.17, this 0.34, all of these figures in the diagram. And then you could calculate your indirect effect, which will be the product, right? Which is what we were speaking of originally. When you see, so for instance, how you see R² is 0.12 here, and you see R² is 0.18 here, things that I want you to think about when you're talking about in your results and your interpretation is those changes. The changes in the R². You see that? That is very key because that is telling you how, remember I kept on, I think you all heard me earlier, keep on harping on R², right? It's because I wanted you to keep in your mind that R² shows you what's happening with the relationship. So it's easy to see when it changes, something happens. So maybe we can't say for sure, but we could say maybe there's a mediation effect occurring depending on what we get. Now, I'm going to mention this very lightly. I am not going to go into this test. Now, this happens if you do not do this through the process macro. You're going to have to test for mediation. You see the same thing we're talking about just now? If you want to do it from scratch, you're going to have to use a statistical test called the Sobel Z-test. Now, in the last iteration of SPSS, I did not see it existing. I'm not too sure if it's existing in the most updated one because my own is a step back from the most updated one. So y'all could always check and see if the Sobel test is in there. I'm not too sure if it is, but we don't necessarily need it if we have the macro. I'm just telling persons just to indicate to you these terms. There is a statistical test called the Sobel Z-test that could test to see if there's a significant indirect effect for mediation, right? I also wanted to mention this word bootstrapping. Have any of you ever heard the term bootstrapping by chance? In statistics? Yes? Great. And for those of you who have not, I'm just going to put this in the simplest way I can. Remember, if you take like a sample, let me see if anybody else. No? Okay, Catherine, that's fine. It's really easy to think about. If you think about, now you say the non-parametric bootstrapping, right? Now, what it looks like, if you think about it from the diagram, I have a little diagram here, right? I hope you all see it. I know it's looking a little small. If you have your original data, right? And you want to ensure, now sometimes what you do with your data, you go and take this data and say, oh, let me just take the mean of the 30 people ages, right? What bootstrapping does, 30, sometimes, okay, let me put 20, because I know sometimes we say 30 or normally distributed. Let me go and do all the parametric tests, right? So if you said that you had about 15 to 20 people, let's say 15 then. What bootstrapping does is that the 15 people in that study, it may not necessarily be normally distributed. So like, for instance, if you just take the mean of those 15 people, it may be a little bit biased, just taking the mean of all those people at once. What the bootstrapping does, to put it simply, is that it actually takes from your sample smaller samples, calculates that value, that mean, or whatever it is you're trying to calculate. I'm saying the mean to make it easier for you all to think about, and keeps on doing that for a number of samples. Now I'm saying like 1,000 times, 5,000 times, right? It's going to do this. So you notice, if you all would notice, look at the small diagram with the original data on the left. And when you consistently keep resampling, watch what happens with the bootstrap distribution. You see how many columns you have there? So it's actually giving you a lot more estimates. And what that does, it makes it closer to the truer estimate. So in English terms, bootstrapping would actually help to nullify those assumptions of normality and actually still reduce the biased nature of the tests that you're doing, depending on the sample size. Now, inside of the process marker that we will talk about in a little bit, you'll actually see that it's already built in there. So you could just, it's a default feature. So it's actually going to do that resampling process for you to reduce any bias. I hope that actually helps you to kind of give you a context, but you could also research it a bit further. Mediation via regression. Now, this is something, when you all heard me talk about hierarchical earlier, I just brought back this idea because it's the same thing I'm going to say. You can do the mediation through a kind of a hierarchical regression. So I want you all to try it on your own time when you get a chance to do it the longer method and see. The Sobel test, you may not necessarily get the values there, but I can give you a site where you could do the Sobel test if you want to get the indirect effect, if you want to do it from scratch and see how this thing happens from scratch, right? This is not as important, but it's just I wanted to show you all the context. You can say, let me go and do the regression, report the R squared, right? The data values, and then put the variables in blocks. And then you could add the mediator in block 2. So you could add whatever variable. So you the dependent variable in block 1, then in block 2, you can add whatever mediator variable. Sorry, the independent variables in block 1, and then the mediator could be in block 2, etc. And what you'll be doing at each stage is you're going to be reporting on those R squared, the F values, the beta, all of these things that you all had done before in regression. So it's nothing new, right? What will happen is you would notice for full mediation, independent variable drops from a significant value to non-significant. So you would see a change. So that's why I kept stressing on when you look at the values, you look at the R squared and all these things, and you look at the P value, you will see a change. And even with partial mediation, you will not see a change in significance. You'll just see the beta value goes from a significant beta to a smaller significance. So that's just to give you an idea of how it looks in terms of normal regression terms, right? Now, partial mediation is usually more commonly observed than full mediation. So basically that same direct effect path that we were thinking about, if there's evidence of mediation, it will be non-significant. So you will say full mediation, as I mentioned before, or else if it's statistically significant, you could infer that is partial mediation. So I just want to keep you all to keep that in mind, full or partial, because I don't want people to say if it's not full mediation, there was no mediation, right? So just be careful with the language you use. Right, so for people who didn't get to install this, what I want to just show you quickly is you could go at any of these sites. So for instance, the processmacro.org, I had sent it in the email as well, but if you didn't get it, just go to processmacro.org and you could follow the instructions. They will actually have a file for you to download. I put the whole folder for you in the Dropbox anyway, so it's not a problem, right? This is the most updated version. They updated some of the routines. And what you're going to do is you are going to put this in a folder. Once you download the zip folder, install it in a place that is accessible to you. Don't put it in somewhere where it could delete easily. Because if that's the case, then you probably delete it and you can't run it from there, right? I'm gonna pull it up a little bit to show you. So from this now, what we will see is that for those of you who have it installed, if you wanted to access it, you would have to go to extensions, utilities, install custom dialog. And it's very easy. From there, it will ask you dialog files installed, analyze regression, and then you just click OK, right? Now I have it installed already, but I'll show you all how that goes, right? But what you would notice is that you should see, the last time I had used it, it was this one. So you would see this 3.4, but there's really 4.3. I have the most updated one, right? So in the meantime, what I want you all to do, any of you who have SPSS, download the gambling study. We could jump in here. What I will do, because I'll have to keep switching, is I'm going to just walk you through how this looks first, and then we will actually do the steps. So first of all, this gambling controlled self-efficacy, if it is that you all are able to bring it up, because I will show you in a little bit how to go from navigation for the process macro straight into the actual mediation. You're going to see these variables, of course, age, sex. Now we're keeping it simple today. This one is just a full set of scale variables. And we have gambling controlled self-efficacy as a mediator of the effects of emotional intelligence on gambling. So emotional intelligence is our independent variable, gambling is our Y variable, and you can draw a nice diagram to show that relationship, right? One of the things you should notice is don't use characters with more than 8. For some reason in this program, you can't use variable names with more than 8 characters. So when you go into it, you would notice that you cannot have anything more than 8 characters. So when we go in, I'm just showing you quickly so we can walk it through. Y variable will be the problem gambling. The X variable is the emotional intelligence. Mediator, you'll put it in here. The model number, you're going to have now numbers 1 to 70 or how many ever that they have now. You're going to click on, you're going to put in 4, and you're going to leave everything else as is. This 95%, you see the number bootstrap there? They're going to give you 5,000. It has different levels there. That is really to reduce the biasness, right? So you're going to bootstrap the samples, and then from the options tab, now, if you want any more information on this, I put one. This is Professor Andy Field also uses this data set, and it's also available at this blogspot. This is a really, really, really great site. Please try and access this site. I'll send you all the link after. It has a lot of great information. So what you need to do here is really standard, straightforward. And Professor Andy Field has this in his text as well. Now, he has a very hilarious video I show my students every year where he goes through the whole 9 yards of talking about what a lot of these things mean, but he says it's a little more complicated or a little more out of the scope. For me, it's out of the scope of this workshop. So I'm not going to go through all of these meanings of all of these things. I'll just draw your attention to when it's mediation, click on generate code for interactions because you want to get that interaction effect there because there's something happening. Show the total effect of the model. Right? These models are classified based on the process macro documentation. So that's why it's classified with these numbers. So 4 for total effect model is for the mediation, and then effect size mediation only models, of course, click on that so you get effect sizes as well. Some of the journals would ask you for that. The probe for interactions less than 0.10, for some reason, they have that set as a default, but you can also change it. But we will leave it as what they have as set as the default. No centering here is important because when it comes to moderation, we would actually want to think about centering the variables or standardizing them. And you can click continue, right? So if you want, I can go to the output, straight to the output, and then we could try it ourselves. Or for those of you who do SPSS, just pull up the output and follow along with me. When you do get the output, this is how it's going to look. Now, I broke it up into pieces. And you're going to see everything in one shot in the file, in the SPSS file. But I'm going to break it up so you could see what's happening here. So you have model 4, you have your Y. When you're reading these things, ensure when you read it, you see which is the variable that is Y, which is the dependent. Make sure that you put them in correctly. You could actually see it here, so you could know X is EI, which is emotional intelligence, M is the self-efficacy. You had a sample size of 112. Now, does this look familiar to you all? Are you all seeing that R and R squared I kept talking about in the beginning? So I'm seeing some, I'm hoping you all see any familiarity, right? The R squared, notice R was 0.38 for this model with these 3 variables. R squared 0.14. You have a p-value of 0.00. Now that 0.14 tells me 14% was explained by the relationship. So we know something was happening, which is why we're looking at the mediation aspect, right? You all are very quiet. Anybody has any questions by chance? Just making sure you all are still here, hearing me. Any questions, anything?
Can you show how to open the process?
Yes,
again?
yes. Yeah, I'm going to do it now, actually. I didn't do it yet because I want to just show you all this first, and then I'm actually going to show you the steps, right? So from here, we're looking at the path. So these are the things I'll go through quickly so you could see. This is what that A value would be corresponding to this coefficient here. The coefficient is the beta value, which you would have seen in regression previously, right? So you would actually be using these now as your path values. And then you have things like the p-value for each of these, right? Then you have LLCI is the lower limit confidence interval, upper limit. They didn't need to call it so fancy. We know the confidence interval, but they wanted to specify it's the lower limit, upper limit, etc. Right? I just kind of drawing your attention so that when we go through it, you'll actually see it when I bring up the output. So the self-efficacy, notice in this one. So what happened here? The first step, model only had emotional intelligence. And then the second step, so remember the program is spitting all of this out for you, right? The second step, model included the self-efficacy and the emotional intelligence to see how it changed. You see how the R squared changed from before? You see, that's why I want you all to keep seeing the changes so you could speak of that in your results. That's what you need to think about. This value here, this coefficient, is going to be the path value. You're going to multiply this on the path. So you're going to have this unstandardized coefficient, this B value, is going to be on the path. So you'll actually see, right? And the C value, same thing. So you're going to see, so let me show you all. So this was actually the self-efficacy. We had the gambling itself, and then we had the total effect, which was just having the emotional intelligence affected the gambling. Remember, the total effect would have been just those two, right? So you could actually see what's happening between those two paths, C. And then you have everybody in the whole kitchen sink here, basically, right? So you have the total effect, you have the direct effect, then you have the indirect effect. So all of this is what you're going to see in the output. So before we go into the sample results, let me carry you all into the, and then we'll talk about the effects. So that was actually the mediation process. So I'm going to take you all back to the web page. So it's, we're gonna have to keep switching now. So for those of you who didn't have process, let me share my screen again, right? And you can go straight into this folder. Tell me if you're seeing my, sorry. Right, in the Dropbox folder, for those of you who didn't have process, I actually have the whole macro here. Now, the easiest thing to do, if you are clicking on this, you would have gotten this from the processmacro.org, right? So you could actually just go and go to processmacro.org/download, right? When you go down here, you could scroll down. Now, this was developed by someone called Andrew Hayes, and it's really a macro is a set of steps. So basically, you know how you all go point and click and do all these nice things in SPSS? He wrote the code behind this specific set of results, instructions or algorithms. So basically, it can be used for SPSS or even R for those of you who are interested, right? And there was a base version. So this is just an additional version. Now he has a whole textbook and a whole set of courses. That's why you're seeing all of this information here. Click download from Resource Hub if you would like. It takes you to the University of Calgary's website. And at this stage, you could go to the resource hub. And now the link I sent you all, for those of you who got the email, I sent you all an easier link because there was a person who actually just put the link directly for you. So I sent that one, but this is actually the full set of steps. And then you just click on download process 4.3, right? So that's the tool that Andrew Hayes developed, and he still gives courses on this at the University of Calgary. So this is really for mediation and moderation for all these different estimation of effects, right? Now, when you click on it, it will download to whatever folder. As I told you, you could unzip it, but unzip it into something. Now, for your demonstration purposes, I am unzipping this into my downloads folder, but don't leave it there in case you delete your downloads, right? Because what will have to happen when you unzip the folder, you would actually see process for R, process for SPSS, process for SAS. Now, we're not using SAS. Those of you interested in R, you could talk to me about that at any point in time as well. For SPSS, you can actually download here, and you could see they have what they call a custom file builder. You'll have to actually use this. Now, don't worry, it's not as complicated as it looks. It's pretty simple when you go into SPSS to do it, right? I'm just showing you all, for those of you who didn't see it before. There's also a syntax file for anybody who's more advanced, where it has all the routines in that code there. But if you're not advanced, that's okay. This custom builder folder has the install in process dialog. So it has some instructions, and this is the file you'll have to quote. Well, this is the file you have to pull to actually point to. So let me show you the actual way this works now, which is when you have it extracted, of course, extracted. I already extracted mine. Let's just jump back into our folder here, and you have to, let me bring up the gambling output. As I said, for those of you who already have it there, you could feel free to look at the SPSS output, right? So I'm going to download this, right? And here we have, okay, once it comes up in a timing, we shall see how this works. For those of you, as I said, you could follow these steps that I just did. I'll run them through again. I also placed, there's also a set of slides in there to show you the same steps I'm talking about on the screen inside the folder. So I just want to cover everybody's bases so that everybody will be covered in terms of following along, right? Apologies, my SPSS is taking a little while. I want to do this from scratch so everybody can be on the same page. So when you do go into here now, it's a simple process of actually, right? Okay, is everybody seeing my SPSS screen?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, great. Anybody, I don't know where everybody is in terms of, because we're not in an actual, that's the one thing about virtual. I can't see what people, what y'all are doing. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to follow along, right? So this is what.
Where I am. This is where I am.
This is where you are? Okay,
Yes.
great, excellent. Right, so for those of you who wouldn't have had this, what would have happened is you would have to go now to extensions. Now I'm using version, I think this is version 28. I'm not too sure if you all, to be honest, I don't know if they went unupdated to 30 yet. I think I'm using 28 still, but there's 29. I'm not too sure if there's 30 yet, right? Should be the same process. Click install. So you go into extension. Let me just do that again. Extensions, utilities, and then install custom dialog. And what will happen is all you're doing here is that wherever now, as I said, don't follow what I did, right? I left the process folder in the downloads. But what you can do is download, what you have it in whatever folder, access it from there, double click the one with process for SPSS, double click the custom builder file, and then this is the file you want to point to. Now, what you'll notice is when I click open, it's going to show me that I already had it installed, right? But for your purposes, I'll just click OK to override the previous version because it's the same thing, right? And this is what you want to see. Dialog files installed too, and this is what you'll see here. Now, the interesting thing I found is that process version 4.2, maybe they didn't change this. It's really 4.3, right? because what I want you all to do is to quote it when you're doing your results. Quote the actual process value, the version. So when you click OK, then you can go into Analyze, and you could actually see in regression that it's actually installed here, right? So if anybody got any problems with that, you could always ask me afterwards if you need any more, if you need me to refer to this again. But this is pretty simple from this point. Now, to be able to use it, you have to have a data set open. So like I said, this is the data set we're dealing with, right? With all the variables about the gambling problem, etc. And then we have the emotional intelligence and the self-efficacy. So we're looking at these in particular. Now, I left the age and sex so that when you all want to try for your own selves, you could actually do some additional moderations and those things, mediation and moderation, right? Right, so let's go through these steps. So we go into Analyze Regression, Process, and these are our variables here. So just extend this. So the problem, gambling, just remind me of the variables. The gambling, the dependent variable was the Y, right? So the dependent variable was the gambling. I'm hoping that was the one. Yes, the self-efficacy was the, let me just check back the
Self-efficacy was mediating.
Mediating, right? Okay, good. Thank you. Right. So self-efficacy was the mediating. And let me just get back to the slide so be on the same page, right? So problem, gambling, EI, right, and self-efficacy. Right? Simple enough. We change this to model number 4. Now, you notice when I click on it, it tells you choose a model number, see appendix. That appendix there will take you to Andrew Hayes' page, and he will explain what each of these models correspond to. So as I said, that's beyond the scope. We're just taking it as it is. Model 4 goes to mediation. If you wanted to do a more complicated version, you'd have to check for the models to see which one corresponds. We're going to leave the 95%. We're going to leave the bootstrap options. Remember, we said here, generate interactions, show total effect, and then standardize effects for the mediation only models, right? We could leave this as 0.1. As I said, this is their benchmark, so I usually leave it as 0.1. I know everybody likes the P.05, but they have it as 0.1 in the standard version of the mediation here. Now, there's a reason for that with respect to the significance, but I don't want to confuse you all with that now, so we'll just leave it there. This part, I just wanted to bring to your attention. Mean center, when you have to do moderation, now we're leaving it as no centering here. Moderation will require you to make sure that only continuous variables that define products. Mean center, all of these long words mean standardize. So when you come to moderation, we will just change this to only continuous variables that define products, because there'll be an interaction of product term. We click continue, and then we click OK. Unless we hope we get some outputs. It's still running. So I'm just giving it some time there, right? Okay, so for people who are running it, are you getting through? Right? So this is all the same information that you would have had lodged in the output, right? So I have everything that I have in the snapshots there. I have them, each slide is outlining everything that you see here, but I wanted to make sure y'all could run it from here. So if you would permit me to go back to these slides to make it easier for you to see now, because we were going through. So what you would see, you would notice that you started off with the outcome variable, the same thing I was telling you. It starts with the self-efficacy. Then you would have seen that we had spoken about the R values, how they change, the P value there. We see the model with just the emotional intelligence in here and any standardized coefficient. These are the values that you'll need to use on those path diagrams. Then you have the next step there where you see we added in the EI and the self-efficacy as well. You could see the changes there, right? And how we quantify them. So you would talk about how the R squared value changed, etc. You would see if it was still significant. And then you would see here, now what I don't understand is in this version of SPSS, it looks, you'll see my output window, I find it looks a little bit off. It looks, hopefully y'all could understand it, right? You could probably export it to an Excel sheet if you find that it's looking a little skewed in terms of where the values are lined up. And then the total effect model, you could actually see now that the total effect, which was between X and Y, specifically the emotional intelligence and the problem gambling, we wanted to see. So there are a lot of things you could extract from here. I will guide you when you talk about your discussion to actually see which ones, how to actually write those, right? And then the total, direct, and then the indirect. Remember that ABC that we were talking about initially? So that is where these values would come from. So those values would actually come from here. So you have the total effect of X on Y. You have the effect value here, minus 0.08. You have the P value. It's really misaligned for some reason. I'm not sure if you're seeing how misaligned it is on your side. The direct effect of X on Y, you actually see in that here, minus 0.03, right? And then you have the P value, still less than 0.05. And interestingly, let me see the indirect effect. So remember, the self-efficacy was the mediating variable. That was the indirect effect between the two. And we see how the effect changes, it goes to 0.0. So remember, the effect was minus 0.08, which is X and Y alone. Then when you had this, the direct effect, basically it was a little bit, it actually lowered, right? The total effect, then it lowered to minus 0.03, and then lowered a little, it actually increased a little bit with the mediator. Sorry, I don't know why this keeps going down, right? So all of this probably looks a little jumbled, so I'll show you it on these slides. But at this point, how do you all feel about this? Is it looking intimidating? Is it looking okay? I all see the trend of where you're going with how we have to talk about specific things. Let me know in any chat. Anything is confusing. If you're not confused, I'll be surprised. Let me see. Looking okay so far? And anybody else who is not, it's not coming together yet, that's okay. Because remember, as I told you all, you will actually, when you actually do this yourselves, you will actually reverse engineer back to what was happening in the first place. So that's why I was giving you a lot of context to think about. So, miss the option selection, Catherine. Which one is that? Oh, let me just show you again. It's regression, process. So the options you left, you put in model 4 here, right? And then in options, generate code for visualizing, show total effect model, because it's model 4, and then standardize effects, mediation only models. Yes, Aliyah, I will reach out and see what we can do department-wise recording. So it's not a problem. And y'all, if y'all have any questions, remember I have my email is there as well, so you could feel free to reach out to me. I know this is a fast session, so even if you don't catch everything, and I'm not expecting you to catch every single thing, right? It's just to kind of whet your appetite a little bit to see what's possible. And so you could actually see now that you could actually do the same type of analysis. It's just you have to walk through the steps. So I'm going to show you, just let me know if you see it. Sometimes are you seeing my PowerPoint again? Just want to make sure. Or are you still seeing my SPSS screen?
I see the PowerPoint now.
PowerPoint? Okay, great. So what you would notice is it will just kind of pull together now what I was telling you before, the values that you would need to think about. So you could see how I would speak about it in a results type of way. If it's looking confusing, if it's looking scary, I understand. It's a lot of information packed in there. But as I said, the easiest way to think about it is from the diagram aspect of what you need to actually pull out of this relationship. So everything I was telling you all before, these parts, so I'm just going to go into this part quickly because I will show you what this means in the end, which is we talk about the part with the C, A, B, and the variables corresponding. And now this is very important for you to think about. Remember I was mentioning this here. So we actually see now we have total effect. You have the direct effect, C prime, right? Then you have the indirect effect. And remember all of these were in the diagram before. So what you will do now, this bootstrap confidence interval, the simplest way to think about it is it kind of gives you the significance level, like a p-value. So if it includes 0, like for instance, in this case, it's not including 0 because these are both negative values. You would see that it may, the effect may not necessarily be significant, right? So there's a way to actually explain this particular portion of it with these bootstrapping confidence intervals. But as I said, I'm keeping it simple for you all. I want you all to focus on the effects. So focus on the effects and think about the p-values corresponding, because this is what we're going to talk about now. So I put it very, very simply. Now, I'm sorry that you might have to keep going backwards to see what this was. Or for those of you who see on your screen with the results, those of you who didn't run it, just open up your Word file. Everything is in there for the mediation version of this. Mediation analysis was run using the SPSS process macro, model 4, 5,000 bootstrap samples for bias correction. You could put as a standard line in this case. What's important is for you to say this: the self-efficacy for gambling control, that's the variable, mediated the relationship between emotional intelligence and problem gambling. And the indirect, what you have to do in this case, because the indirect effect here, you'll have to state these things, state the actual value, also state the confidence interval. Sometimes they want the p-value, but standard APA, some of you may do Chicago, you might have to state the B or the beta value here, and then the confidence interval, right? So it was found to mediate the relationship. And then the direct effect, so you have to talk about the indirect effect and what happened with it. The direct effect, meaning those particular variables, and then the specific B value. And this is the way you would have to do that sort of write-up. This is just an example, right? Because I have a guest speaker who's coming who's going to actually show you how to do it, how it was done in some of her PhD work. So it will actually give you some context as to how it looks. But this is just for this simple example here. So what I want you all to take away is you have to speak about the direct effects, the indirect effect, the total effect. Because what you want to tell people is, look what happened here. This mediating variable made a change in the relationship between these independent and dependent variable. And I am showing you this with supporting metrics through the B values, which is the effect of it. The effect size, and if it is that there's a significant effect size or not. Now, I wanted to show you it in a diagram, right? This is how you could put it into a diagram, and this is how you could probably quote it in. Now, these slides are actually inside the process macro. So if you want to see everything that I'm saying here, this particular set of slides with this output is in there, right? So you could also follow along. So the original direct total effect would have been this 0.08 here, C, the relationship between the two, and then you would have noticed, you notice how this value here, 0.04 decreased. So something else happened outside, which was due to the self-efficacy value. And then you have to put in, so that's what you're using the process for. You're actually using the process now to quote what those values are and actually tell people what they are on the diagram. No, that was a mouthful. Anybody has any question? Is it just that, is it understandable to see the trend of where it's going? Is it confusing? Feel free to let me know. Anybody has any questions so far? No? Can I jump right into, sorry, let me see, I have a question. No questions? Okay, great. Can I jump right into moderation? Because it's actually going to go a little faster now. Yes? Okay, great. Right, so moderation now. Now remember, we already spoke about this initially, so I'm just going to bypass these things. We're going to conduct it. We're going to use the process macro. This is an example, as we had seen initially. What I want you all to take away from moderation is there's some sort of interaction term that you're going to see happening here. So the levels of effect change between X and Y. So whatever, it's impacting the relationship here, right? So it's actually going to introduce an interaction term. So why is moderation used? Because you could affect the strength of the relationship. So I want you all to think about the strength and the direction of the relationship. Moderation is going to actually give you a context of that. So like, for instance, with male and female, or even like the mental health one that we were looking at earlier. Now, this is key. It does not have a causal relationship with the independent variable. So if you have a question, does the independent variable influence the moderator variable in our study? The answer should be no. You don't want those kind of collinearities happening there, because you can't necessarily say it's a moderator if there's some other influence happening, right? So you have to, now as I say, this, I'm showing you from a very base version. There are going to be a lot more complicated versions, meaning that they will have other mediating moderators or all these other things happening, but this is for the base version. Now, someone has a question. Sure, Sherman, yes. Y'all could, anybody who needs recording and those things, y'all could send me an email and I will see if I can supply. I will speak with the department about it, right? So how is moderation performed? So this is where I wanted to tell you, you can perform the moderation in SPSS without the macro, and this is the way you would do it. I'm not going to go through these steps for this purpose, right? These steps are just to standardize the variables. Of course, as I said, reach out to me if you want me to go through it, but I have 2 sites I'll give you at the end where we'll go through the entire process to show you how to do it without the process, pun intended, macro, right? But the easiest approach is to calculate the interaction effects using this macro, right? You could do it through multiple regression. Right, so we already know the moderator affects the strength. I always keep I want you to keep that in mind, because that is going to give you a context of what moderation is in terms of the interaction there. So the independent variables don't need to be correlated with each other, and the link between the independent and the dependent is different for high versus low levels of the moderator. If you have a high and low moderator, or if you have like male or female, right? You can have things like that as well. So think about it in terms of moderation. You're moderating the relationship with some sort of levels, right? So everything here is a regression analysis. Yes, sure, Sherman. And you could send me an email afterwards as well to remind me in case I lose it here. I wouldn't have access to this. So this is how this looks. As I said, I don't want it to look scary to you all, but just think about originally, this is the moderation, right? This is how it looks on the left. On the right, this is how the moderation regression equation would look, meaning all that you would see included here. So if we had 2 independent variables, X and Z, and then we had this independent Y, there's also a possibility of an interaction between X and Z. And Z is our moderating, or MO is our moderating variable, if you want to call it that. So you would notice inside the regression equation, it accounts for that interaction here, right? So that's important. So to test for moderation, you have to construct a new variable. Now, as I said, in terms of going through all these steps, this is just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like, but you will have the process macro to do it. So you include this interaction term as a predictor in a regression model. And then you would look at the regression. So everything you're looking at is the regression coefficients. Now, the added thing that you have that you didn't have before with mediation is you have an interaction term that may be significantly different from 0. If that is the case, then there's evidence of moderation. And what does that mean to the person on the street? That is, the effect of X on Y depends on this particular moderating value, be it gender, moderating variable, be it gender or whatever it is. So for instance, if you want to think of some examples, independent, self-esteem impacts on grades, but moderated by motivation to study. So for instance, how would that look in a statement? High motivation has a link between self-esteem and grades, but at low motivation, there's usually no link. So most perform poorly, right? That's just general knowledge then. And you may have a theorist who might have done some work to support it. Hard drugs lead to increased mortality, but moderated by car ownership. So at low car ownership, you could say probably drugs lead to mortality, but at high car ownership, no, this is a foreign study, so I don't know how it was in Trinidad. The link is stronger, right? And then this was an example I really liked. I am also involved in things related to climate change. That you could see here, negative emotions about climate change and support for government action can be moderated by age. So you could hypothesize that the relationship between negative emotions about climate change and support for government action on climate change will be stronger among older people. You could actually hypothesize that and test it. So you see the language, for those of you who need the context of the language that you need to use. Now, as I said before, if process is not used, I'm not going to go through this. If this looks scary, that's okay. All this is telling you is you would have to standardize your independent variable and the moderating variable. That's to reduce multi-collinearity, because you don't want the things, if everybody related, then it's actually, you probably have no sort of regression equation to find, because then you don't want everything to be too highly correlated, right? So it's a simple process to do if you want to do it from scratch, but you don't need to. Just for those of you interested, you could standardize it first, and then you could go through and do the same thing. You could actually include an interaction term. So I will send you a site to show you all those steps. You don't have to worry about that. But as I said, you don't need it for this purpose. What I would like to recommend, though, is that you can plot. Now, process doesn't plot the interaction, but you can plot it through like your one-way ANOVA or your univariate the tab in regression. When you do that in analyze regression, you can plot. I like to plot the statistical interaction. You will see it just now. I'll show you all as well. This is also just following on from there for those of you who are interested in that aspect. You would have something called conditional effects based on that moderating value. So you have the language changing a little bit for moderation. Why I mentioned this, and even if you don't understand all of this, what you could take away from what is being said here, Icahn and West said that high and low values in terms of that moderating relationship for a continuous moderator, they have like a benchmark in terms of the standard deviation. And that's kind of why we look at using the standardized values. Now, if you want to look at it from the context of, say, dichotomous variables, or like variables like this, where you have low age, or if you categorize age. So you could categorize age if you prefer, and you could see for the support for government action. Remember just now I was talking about the climate change and that sort of thing. Negative emotions, high negative emotions, low negative. If you see this happening in your graph, when you plot it, and you have low age and then you have high age, you could see there's something happening here, which we suspect is some sort of interaction. Now, why I'm telling you this is because even if you didn't even reach the moderation yet, right? Let's just say you were doing your little correlations, oh, let me do a regression on all these things. Let me categorize some variable. Let me see what happens. I want you all to explore. Don't be afraid to explore. This is the statistician and me coming out now, right? So basically, if you were to plot a diagram and you saw this happen, you should tell yourself, oh, okay, there may be some sort of something happening if you didn't know already, right? This kind of gives you a context to show there's an interaction happening here because of the crossing of the lines. And that's what you want to think about, because then it's telling you maybe something is moderating, right? So same thing we're going to do as before. I don't know if you all need me to go back into the SPSS, if I could just run through it on the snapshots, as I think you all would have the idea now to do it the way I did it in these steps. And the same thing with the snapshots, I have all the output for you already in the folder. So what we're going to do in this case now, we're going to look to see, does self-efficacy moderate the effects of emotional intelligence on the problem, the gambling problem? So you want to see if it moderates it. As I said, for more information, you could feel free to look at this resource, and I have some more of that in the folder as well. So I put everything for you to click here. For those of you who are following along, for ease, for the sake of time, because I know we have 20 minutes again, and our guest speaker will come on in 5 minutes. I just wanted to show you basically the steps. The model number that changes for regression, for moderation is 1, right? And then we have, you can still leave the bootstrap here as 5,000, The only difference is you're going to, instead of putting the mediator here, you're going to put this as a moderator down here. So your moderator variable goes here. In the options tab, you're going to take out the show total model. All you're going to leave is generate code for visualizing interactions, which you already had before, right? Nothing else you have to change except, as I told you all variables. Now, some people, you would see a bit of a difference online. Some of them would have it as all variables are defined products or only continuous variables. In this case, all our variables were continuous. So you can put it as only continuous, but if you want for generality, if you had ordinal variables too, you could cover that as well. So you could leave that there. So that should be okay, right? So this is what I wanted to show you all the output. Now, as I said, the output, I know you'll have to probably go back into it. So all of it is there for you. But in terms of looking at what I want to point out, same kind of thing as before, the model summary. We have our R value, 72% or so, 0.72. R squared is 0.53. So you see R squared is midway. So you could use your strong positive. So 53% of the relationship is explained by these variables here. So something else, as we said, we already know, we assume there's a moderation happening. Then this int variable is an interaction between the independent variable, which is emotional intelligence, and the moderator, which is self-efficacy. So it's the product of the two. So int underscore 1 is actually EI multiplied by self-efficacy. So what it's telling you is what's happening between these two. So same thing as before. Now, why they said this is not looking good is because it's very close to 0. So it's probably not necessarily any interaction in the first place, meaning it probably didn't even, it may not necessarily be moderating the relationship. We don't know yet, right? So that's the preliminary look at what we're seeing here, right? And then we have the p-value, because the p-value is telling me it's not less than 0.05. So it means that it's not significant. So the interaction may not be significant. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean there's no moderation, but we're not too sure what's happening, right? So you will have some additional terms. So you see the product here, int is EI by this. You would see here further now further to this, what I want to tell you all is everybody harps on these p-values, but I want you all to be best friends with the R squared values, please, right? Because the R squared value tells you a lot as well. Like you see how they changed the R squared here, and then you see how it was up here first, and then how it changed here. These are easy things for you all to pick out and point out, right? Those changes. So let's go to the next one. No, sorry, this you could bypass this. This is actually just to show you could generate these values to make a graph, like I had shown you all before, right? The graph just now, you could actually produce it from scratch, right? And you have it as in a line version. Line version is better, but this actually produces a scatter plot, so you could see it like that, right? So what I wanted to show you all just now when we were saying this was not looking good is because it actually ended up not being significant. The interaction here. So what you could say in the end, process model, ran process model, the self-efficacy for gambling did not moderate the relationship, and you have to support that, right? The interaction was not statistically significant. So I can't come and say, oh, it just didn't moderate it. You have to give the context. Remember, this is statistical significance, it's not necessarily practical significance. What I'm saying is, you don't necessarily know what occurred in your specific data set, but what happened is this is happening in your sample. And why I pointed this out too, the overall model. So besides talking about these values, so you know the B values, the beta that we saw is very close to 0. So it means they're probably not even existent. The overall moderation, remember that R squared I told you how to make best friends with? R squared is 53% of the problem gambling variance. So that's what I was telling you all in layman's terms, 53% of it's explained there. So even so this didn't moderate, maybe something else happened, but at least you tested it to see, and you could support it by the p-value. It's significant here, and then the f value, all of these additional values, right? Now, this, as I said, you could perform this from scratch using regression analysis, and you could feel free to do it on your own time, just using a typical regression and just compare. I want you all to kind of get more exploratory with these things. From the regression, you'll get the same coefficients, etc. And the line for interactions, you could actually do that in a one-way ANOVA. for the different levels that you would have had for that variable. Now, because we have close to time, I would have liked you all to try it on your own, but you could try it as when you get chance to moderate for sex on the emotional intelligence and the problem gambling. And feel free, if you all try it on your own, to reach out to me. I'm always available via email if you want me to check anything for you. That's a practice exercise for you to try. I actually do have the answers there, so you could it was really for you all to go through and kind of fill out the values, right? The results are also here to see as well, right? I wanted to also give you all some ideas of how to put them into, like, for instance, a table, but, and all the results. But in fact, I'm very happy to report that our right, so the collaborative activity, I had the data set for you to do an activity as well, but I could actually just send you the Google Doc, the Google link after, so you could actually see. It's a really nice comprehensive link I made for you all. So lots of activities just in case you all had time to do it. But now come to the, I am very, very pleased to present, and I am hoping she is on. Let me see. Right, so I am going to stop sharing my screen. Before I stop sharing, she's going to talk about all of this that I am speaking about now, using data to build a story. But our guest speaker, for those of you who know her, is Miss Fareena Alladin. So Fareena, I'm very happy to allow you to take the floor to go ahead, and you should be able to have sharing privileges. So welcome everyone. So Fareena, for those of you who don't know Fareena, most of you would know her. You could give them a little background and share your screen and go ahead. She's going to talk about some of the work she has been doing. She has been using this quite a lot in her research. So Fareena, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Are you all seeing the screen?
Yes.
Put down the full screen. You're all seeing it full screen, right?
Yes, now we are.
Okay, all right. All right, so thank you for the introduction. So Dr. Addison just asked me to speak a little bit about my work, since I'm using moderation specifically. So not mediation, but it would show an application of how moderation could be used in research. So my research is basically focusing on food consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic period, the first year of the pandemic in Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm based in sociology, so my research uses sociological theories, or one sociological theory and one nutrition theory, because it falls within what is called the sociology of food. And also because it's sociological, we use the Chicago Manual of Style. So as Dr. Addison mentioned, you really need to check what is your particular referencing style. If that has any specific ways, you have to report your results as well. So the way that you see it reported here may or may not necessarily be what you are required to do in terms of the formatting, but the information itself should more or less be the same. So what I have here are my research questions. So as Dr. Addison mentioned at the start, whatever analysis you do has to be connected to what you're trying to achieve in your overall research. So here I've bolded the research question that actually relates to moderation. So the other three would be answered using some other kind of analysis, maybe descriptive, test of difference, correlation, etc. But this one here, to what extent does cultural capital moderate the relationship between, and this would be one of my independent variables, home food environment, and my dependent variable, which is individual food consumption. So mediation and moderation are kind of, to us, might seem like fancy analysis to do because we're more accustomed to just the basic t-test and over correlation. And we might want to do mediation or moderation, especially now that we might be exposed to it. But we can't just do it just because we feel to. It has to be related to some research question or research objective or hypothesis that you're trying to answer or achieve or test. So this is the research question here. And by the end of the presentation, this research question will be answered right through the moderation process. So it has the word moderate in the research question itself. It has what would be the moderating variable, which is cultural capital. And then it has the IV and the DV. And then those would find themselves in the conceptual model as well. So in sociology, and I'm thinking in other programs as well, we're required to have a conceptual model or diagram that shows how we predict the variables to be connected to each other. So I have my D phi or my Y variable here. These are the independent variables, but I'm really just focusing on the ones at the bottom here for the purpose of the moderation. So home food environment has two parts to it, and this is coming from one of my theories, my nutrition theory, which basically says that availability and accessibility that people have for food within their home affects what they would consume. And then the other theory, which is the sociological theory from Pierre Bourdieu, who some of you all might have come across in your specific programs. He speaks about cultural capital, right? The amount of cultural capital or resources that somebody has based on the economic position and so on. So for moderation, I'm looking at here. So this is home food environment moderated by cultural capital in terms of the effect on food consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the side here, I have what would be the diagram from Andrew Hayes, as Dr. Addison mentioned, and also from Baron and Kenny when they first came up with mediation and moderation. So once you have your conceptual model, if you want to use mediation and moderation, then you kind of have to line up, all right, how have I conceptualized this thing with how can I statistically test this thing? So you have your conceptual model, which is your abstract way of how you think the variables are related. But to test it, it has to connect with some statistical diagram as well. And that's why I have this one here. So the X would be the home food environment, Y would be the food consumption, and W, which is the letter or the symbol to represent moderation, would be the cultural capital here. If I wanted to use mediation, then it would mean I would have the three arrows going from X to M and then the M to the Y, but that's not what my conceptual model looks like. So conceptually, it looks like moderation, and then statistically, it will be tested through moderation as well. So this should have just been what I did. So Dr. Addison walked you all through the steps in terms of SPSS and what you would do. I just kind of have it reported on here. So it would have used moderation analysis, specifically model 1, which is what she would have just shown you all through the pictures. And model 1 is basically this. You have an X, you have a Y, you have one moderating variable, which is exactly what I have here in my conceptual diagram. So I did it 4 times, and the reason that I did it 4 times is because of how my variables were conceptualized and operationalized. So food consumption for my study was broken down into healthy food consumption and unhealthy food. So that's why it's mentioned here 4 times as the Y variable. And then the X would have been food availability for unhealthy and healthy, food accessibility for unhealthy and healthy. Right, so that's why I have it as 4 different times that I would have done moderation. But the moderator variable is the same throughout. So I just had to do it 4 times because of how my variables were, but obviously yours would be dependent on how many variables you have and how you have conceptualized and operationalized and measure them in your questionnaire or whatever you're using. And I would have used his process macro as she was explaining to do this moderation. So this is the result. So I don't have it in terms of the SPSS output and stuff because I know she would have already been going through that with you all. So the study assessed the moderating role of cultural capital on the relationship between home food environment, which I have as food availability and food accessibility, and individual food consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic, and food consumption operationalized as the unhealthy food consumption and healthy food consumption. So basically the same thing here. I just written out in words. The results revealed a negative and significant moderating impact of cultural capital on the relationship between availability of unhealthy food and individual consumption of unhealthy food. And then I have the numbers here. And these are the numbers that she would have shown you all how to get from the output that the process generates. So there's a lot of numbers and stuff in the output, and you really just have to read through and then pick out what is actually necessary, because some of it might not actually need to be reported on. And so here, like for Chicago, we don't, or in sociology at least, we don't really use confidence intervals and levels too much in the reporting. So I don't have it here. But if you are using APA format or some other format that requires it, then you would have it, right? We more just have the coefficients and the p-value. So I would have done this 4 times, but only one of them was significant, which is this last one here. If in the relationship between availability of unhealthy food and unhealthy food consumption is moderated by cultural capital, all of the others were not significant. So for the purposes of today, I'm just talking about the significant one, but as Dr. Addison said, you would have to report on all of your findings, because just because something isn't statistically significant doesn't mean that you disregard it, right? It's not significant in terms of numbers for some kind of reason. Maybe it's not applicable in the Caribbean context or whatever, or theoretically or whatever it is. So I would report on all 4, but just for today, I'm just looking at this one here because you'll be able to see all of the different values in action. So this would be the general finding in terms of overall model. And then there's also what is called slope analysis, and that's what you do to get the line graph that she showed. Right, and as she said, you get the syntax thing, and then you drop it into process, and it creates the line graph for you. And there are step-by-step websites that tell you how to do it as well, right? Which is what I had used to figure out how to do this moderation and mediation analysis. So the simple slope analysis was conducted to better understand the nature of the moderating effects. So because there is a significant moderating effect here, then as she said, now you want to figure out the how of how this actually happened. And the end result would have been this here. So you have the slope analysis, so it gives you 2 lines because I had groups of high cultural capital and low cultural capital. And then I just drew the line to connect it. So what it tells you is that the line, you basically have to look and see which line is steeper. And the blue line, which is the low cultural capital group, is steeper than the pinkish purplish line, which is the high cultural capital group. So what this would mean is that yes, availability of the unhealthy food affects consumption of unhealthy food, but because of the slope of the line, this impact is more for persons with low cultural capital, right? And not so much for the high cultural capital, even though there is still an effect here, but the slope tells you which group is more affected, or how, in this case, cultural capital actually affects these variables. And then to put all of that together in terms of something like a discussion, so you would bring back the research question that it was meant to answer, because by the time an examiner has read through the whole thing, they might have forgotten what research questions you were actually looking at. So you just re-emphasize this question was asked, this research question here. Based on the results, cultural capital was found to moderate the relationship between the 2 variables. Pull out what the slope analysis told you, and you kind of break it down into how you understand it based on your variables, and not necessarily just in terms of the numbers and the statistics and stuff. And then you connect it back to, in this case, the theory. So this finding supported both of the theories, which basically said that cultural capital does moderate access, availability, and food consumption. And where it relates to your literature as well, you would add it in to create a holistic kind of discussion. So the key takeaways from this is that your analysis, moderation, or even mediation has to fit with your study. You can't just do it because you feel like doing it, or because you want to try out something, you want to impress your examiners, right? Because if you do that, but there's no basis for it, then it would just be considered as incorrect. So your analysis has to fit with your research questions, objectives, and your hypotheses, if you have hypotheses specifically written for moderation or mediation. They also have to have some kind of justification, right? Which is why I showed the conceptual model. So that justification has to come from your literature review or your theory or a combination of both, meaning previous researchers have indicated mediation and moderation exists, or your theory proposes mediation or moderation occurs in these variables. And also it's a lot easier than it seems. So this was a packed session in terms of what Dr. Addison presented and probably also what I did. But just like with anything in statistics, once you practice it in a step-by-step way, it becomes easier to do. And the good thing with SPSS is that you could run your analysis how many FOAs you want and then see what is actually accurate and use as much practice and then pull it out specifically for your study. And as I said, there are step-by-step websites that tell you exactly what to do and how to interpret as well, in addition to what Dr. Addison would have gone through today. So I'm going to stop the sharing on my end, and then if you all have any questions, you all can feel free to ask, and I guess Dr. Addison and I will probably field them together.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh, Fareena, thank you so much. I am very, very happy Fareena was able to give you all, she was able to take time out of her schedule today to really present to you all. And I hope that, you know, she made some very, very important points. I mean, she's doing an excellent research and actually see how she's applying the moderation in her work. And as she said, yes, this is a packed session, so we would have been throwing a lot at you. But it's really to kind of show you what's possible. And once you do it in a step-by-step way, as she said, it's not as difficult as it may seem. Because at the end of the day, it's really for you to, once you understand what your variables are, as she said, the context that you're using it for, then you'll be able to proceed with whichever is really aligned with your research. So Fareena, thank you so much. I'll give you a virtual applause. And you all have any questions for Fareena or myself based on the session today? I put some links for you in the chat. Those are some, I'm telling you all those 2 links, the first 2 on how to run mediation and how to run moderation SPSS. They are very simplified and very, the format is really nice and easy to work with. So you all can look into those 2 links. And I also put a feedback form. Anybody has any burning questions or anything for Fareena or myself based on the session today? Any comments? Has it been a lot?
I'm really grateful. I concluded the same as Fareena. At the start, it was very daunting,
Yes.
but now I feel like you know, you've cleared some of the mystery of it all. So thank you very much for the session today.
You're most welcome, and no problem at all. And I always wanted to tell you all as well. I mean, don't ever think that we feel like we ourselves, actually, I'm sure Fareena will agree, we also still learning as well. And sometimes we need to take a step back and kind of go back into material. So it's not always an easy process, I would say. It's still a challenge at times, but at least once you give it some, you know, give it some effort, reach out if you need. I always, I'm a huge proponent for reaching out for support. And for assistance and inspiration. So really and truly, Fareena's talk was to really show you all how you could get, because she's a PhD candidate and she's almost finished the process. So you could see where you can be with your research. So I'm hoping that it will be helpful. For those of you who didn't get to catch everything, it's okay. Feel free to reach out to either of us. Email me if you need to get any of the Dropbox links or anything else, the previous email. And yeah, the floor is open again for any questions. Anyone else before? I know we are 5 minutes a little over time. Is there anyone else who wants to make any comment or has any question moving forward before we end off? Okay, well, I think it was okay. Thank you. Chelsea said it was a really great session. Thank you. Good. Yes, so definitely. Sure. Yes. Definitely, please email us, and we expect questions, because as I said, this is a crash session. Usually when I teach mediation and moderation in the advanced statistics, we don't go too in depth either. We just kind of touch the surface. I did a little bit more for you all in terms of kind of going back into the previous material as well. So I'm glad, yes. So I'm glad it's been helpful. Fareena, you want to put your email address in the chat as well? I'll put mine. I think some of them, I don't know if, yes, Fareena's still here, right?
Yep, I'm typing it in, yeah.
Right, so can reach out to either of us and we'll help you with your questions. So those of you that said who missed anything, just send me an email and I will forward that original email to you. And if you don't have the Dropbox, let me know as well, because the Dropbox has everything in there, right? So yeah, so thank you once again for taking the time out on your Saturday to participate in the session. As I said, you can feel free, no problem at all, Dion. Feel free to reach out to us to answer any of your questions moving forward with your research. We'd be happy to facilitate any one-on-one to kind of assist you. Oh, and I put a feedback form, so please fill out the feedback, and also in the feedback, let us know if there are any other sessions that you would like to see. I'm just going to paste it again. You can take that with you and just let us know so we can have an idea of what other workshops you all would want to see from us. Okay, so that's it from me. Fareena, any last words?
I guess just all the best in your work, and as I said before, make sure you'll actually need to use either the mediation or moderation, and you have a good grasp of them before you try to use it as well, because it's easy to do the kind of wrong analysis, especially when you're not exactly sure what you're supposed to be doing. So just take your time in it and you'll be fine with this and any other kind of analysis that you'll be doing.
Yes, agreed. I totally support these sentiments, Fareena. Right. So yeah, so good luck in everything. You'll enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Stay safe out there, and yeah, we'll catch you again in hopefully another edition. So please take care and enjoy.